Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. The sun was already halfway through the sky when the screech of tires faded into the distant hum of everyday Ibadan traffic. In a small yellow-painted house off Adebisi Crescent, a kettle sang lazily on the stovetop while the television mumbled lowly in the living room. Mike Hartley stood barefoot in the hallway, half dressed in his faded wrapper, watching the steam curl from the spout. The day was like any other, ordinary, quiet, unremarkable in appearance, but there was a strange tightness in the air, the kind that creeps in before a storm but doesn't announce itself. The house smelled faintly of baby powder, warm tea, and roasted groundnuts. Behind the closed door of the children's room, the muffled laughter of Sophie and Lena danced between arguments over a missing doll. Aaron was asleep in his crib, one hand clutched in a tiny fist near his cheek. Mike's eyes lingered there for a moment, softening. In that instant, father had felt like both a crown and a cross. He leaned against the doorframe, the wood pressing into his shoulder blades, and exhaled slowly. Life wasn't perfect. It was barely manageable. But it was theirs. He remembered the night they had made the decision, he and Emily. The light had gone out that evening, Nipa doing what it did best. Candles flickered shadows on the wall as they sat across from each other at the dining table, sweat glistening on their foreheads. 3 children was enough. They agreed. Their hands touched in silent promise across the table. There had been laughter in the air then, and a mutual relief. They would raise their children, focus on survival, on stability, on keeping the roof over their heads from leaking both rainwater and resentment. That decision wasn't made lightly. It was forged in exhaustion and necessity. Emily's laughter used to fill the kitchen every Saturday morning, as she blended pepper for stew with music from the radio humming beneath her breath. But lately, that joy had become a whisper, almost like it was being rationed. She was still loving, present, attentive, responsible, but something in her eyes looked far away. Mike noticed the shift in small things. The way she lingered too long on her phone, her eyes gleaming when she scrolled through baby reels. The way she'd pause while folding laundry, a wistful expression crawling over her face like the mist that hugged the hills of Makola in the early morning. One evening, after the children had fallen asleep and the house fell into that delicate, golden silence of exhausted peace, she nudged her phone toward Mike. It was a video, an infant barely days old, yawning with its tiny fists curled like soft chin-chin. Emily smiled as she watched Mike watch it. "Don't you miss that stage?" she asked, not looking at him directly, her fingers lightly tracing circles on the armrest of the couch. Mike chuckled, not taking her seriously. "Don't start," he replied, his voice playful, brushing it off like the first fly of harmattan. She smiled too, but it didn't reach her eyes. That was the first time she mentioned it. The seed had been planted, and though Mike didn't know it then, the roots were already finding their way into the cracks of their quiet agreement. He assumed it was a passing feeling, a moment of nostalgia. After all, who didn't miss the softness of a newborn? But he thought nothing of it. Not yet. 3 days later, she mentioned it again, this time over dinner. The children were making a mess with their jollof rice, laughing at something only children found funny. Mike was trying to clean Aaron's chin while answering Sophie's never-ending questions about snakes and mangoes. Amid the chaos, Emily leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand, and said, "You know, if we had one more, I'd be okay with it being a girl or boy. I just want that feeling again." Mike looked up, blinking. "What feeling?" She shrugged, her eyes drifting to the children. "That feeling of holding something brand new. Something that belongs to both of us. Something small enough to fit in your palm, but big enough to fill your whole heart." Mike shook his head gently. "We've got 3. That's already a full house." She smiled but didn't argue. She just leaned back and wiped Aaron's mouth, her movements slow, like someone counting backwards from a dream. That night, when they lay in bed, Mike stared at the ceiling fan circling above them, the shadows spinning like memories. Emily had turned to her side, facing away from him, her breaths even but her body tense. He wanted to say something, anything, but instead he closed his eyes and tried to silence the quiet knocking that had begun inside his chest. It was faint, but steady, like a far-off drum at a village festival. Something was shifting, and he could feel it. The days that followed unspooled like ribbon from an overstuffed box. Emily started speaking about babies more frequently, sometimes subtly, other times directly. She would show him photos, stories, even quote articles about women who had babies at 35 and felt reborn. Mike didn't take offense. At first, he simply thought she was caught in a phase, maybe emotional residue from Aaron's first birthday. But then came the night she sat on the edge of the bed and asked, "Mike, what if God wants us to have just one more? What if the agreement was made in fear, not in faith?" Her voice didn't sound like her own. It sounded borrowed, like something she'd rehearsed. Mike sat up slowly, his voice low. "Emily, don't do that. We made that decision together. It wasn't fear. It was wisdom. It was survival." She looked at him then, her eyes wide and wet, but she said nothing. Instead, she lay back down, turned her face to the wall, and said softly, "I just feel like there's still room in our story." Mike didn't know what to say. He pulled the duvet over his chest and stared once again at the ceiling fan. Round and round it went, just like the thought in his mind. Is this about a baby, or is it about something we haven't said aloud yet? Mike's days began to stretch longer than usual, not because his workload had increased, but because his thoughts had started lingering too long between tasks. A single nail driven into wood now took twice the time it used to. His hands moved with precision, but his mind wandered far from the workshop. The scent of sawdust no longer brought comfort. It carried a strange loneliness, as though the timber itself reminded him of things once stable, now beginning to warp. The radio played old Fuji tunes in the background, but even those melodies seemed tired. He could still hear Emily's words echoing behind his thoughts, soft, persistent, unsettling. At night, he found himself turning toward the other side of the bed, watching her silhouette lit faintly by the orange glow of the hallway bulb, hoping that maybe tonight she'd return to her old self, the one who once laughed mid-sentence and spilled stew on the gas cooker without minding. But her silence now filled the room like a heavy curtain. She hadn't brought up the topic again directly, but everything she did whispered it. She lingered longer in the children's room at bedtime, sometimes holding Aaron close for minutes after he had fallen asleep, as if trying to imprint the weight of his infancy onto her skin. Mike watched quietly, torn between admiration and ache. He understood her longing. He felt it too sometimes, an ache that visited gently, like evening dew on rusted zinc. But he didn't allow it to take root. He couldn't afford to. Their conversations became smaller, lighter, and eventually too polite. They spoke of groceries, of school runs, of who would fix the leaking tap behind the bathroom. But underneath those words lay rivers of things unsaid. Sometimes Mike tried to steer them toward deeper waters, but Emily would always find a way to float back to the surface. It was like trying to hold water in his hands. No matter how tightly he tried to grip, it slipped through. One Saturday morning, after taking the children to the barber's shop near Bodija, Mike returned home to find Emily sitting on the veranda with her head tilted toward the sky. Her face was bathed in light, but her eyes looked tired, like someone who had stayed awake through too many thoughts. He joined her without speaking. They sat like that for a while, letting the air speak for them. Finally, she turned to him and asked, "Do you think our lives are full?" The question floated between them like smoke from a smoldering pot. Mike looked at her, unsure how to answer. Was she asking about their finances? Their family? Or something deeper? He hesitated, then said carefully, "We've built something beautiful. It may not be perfect, but it's full of love." Emily smiled faintly, but the sadness in her eyes didn't budge. "Sometimes I feel like I'm standing in a room with all the lights on, but there's still a corner in shadow. I can't explain it." Mike said nothing. He just reached for her hand, and for the first time in weeks, she didn't pull away. It wasn't long after that quiet morning that Emily began staying up later than usual. Mike would come out to get water around midnight and find her at the dining table, a stack of old baby clothes folded in front of her, as if she were preparing a gift for someone who hadn't yet been invited. She wasn't crying, but her silence had changed shape. It had become expectant, like the hush before a heavy rainfall. One night, she held up a tiny pair of blue socks and asked, "Do you remember buying these?" Mike nodded slowly, though he didn't. "You brought them home after Aaron was born. You said they reminded you of your father's first Sunday cap." She chuckled faintly at the memory, then folded the socks with care and placed them back in the drawer. Mike didn't respond. He couldn't find the right words to place between them. Each night after that, she left one small item on the table, an old bottle, a baby rattle, a knitted cap, like breadcrumbs in a forest, hoping someone would follow. Mike began to fear that no matter what he said, Emily's heart had already begun nesting for a child that didn't yet exist. It felt as if he were watching her drift across a river he couldn't cross. He wanted to call her back, but he feared that his voice wouldn't reach her anymore. Mike's mother had once told him that love, when not watered, quietly grows roots elsewhere. At the time, he didn't understand her. He had been young, in love, and full of dreams. But now, sitting alone in the backyard while crickets played their midnight tune, her words replayed like a warning. He wondered if Emily's yearning wasn't just about a baby, but about reclaiming something she felt slipping away. Her youth, perhaps, or a season of their marriage she feared had ended too quickly. He thought back to the early years, when they were still in Makola, renting a one-room flat with cracked tiles and a dusty fan that refused to spin unless begged. Back then, they dreamed of a family, but never imagined it would one day divide them. They thought love would be enough. But now he realized that even love, left unchecked, could become unfamiliar. The house was still filled with laughter, Sophie's endless riddles, Lena's mischief, Aaron's babbles, but between those sounds was an absence that hummed like an old fridge. Mike lay awake most nights now, staring at the ceiling, wondering how to mend something that hadn't broken loudly. No arguments, no screaming, just a slow unraveling. He feared that one day he'd wake up and find Emily gone, not physically, but emotionally, lost in a dream of a child she never had, standing in that same shadowed corner she once spoke of. The rhythm of Mike and Emily's days changed without warning or fanfare. What once felt like the familiar hum of routine had now become a strained duet of politeness and distance. They moved around each other like strangers on a crowded Danfo bus, close in proximity but far in spirit. Emily no longer left baby items on the table, but she also didn't stop bringing up the idea of having another child. It became part of the air, lingering in every room like a scent you couldn't name but couldn't ignore. One Wednesday evening, as the scent of fried plantain floated from the kitchen, Emily leaned against the doorframe and asked, without preamble, "Would you really be unhappy if we had one more?" Her tone was casual, but her eyes betrayed a deeper plea, like a person trying not to beg while standing in the rain. Mike looked up from his chair where he was sanding a small wooden stool for Lena's class project. He paused, brushed the dust from his hands, and answered with measured honesty, "I'd be worried. Not just about money. About us. About what we're stretching to hold together." Emily nodded slowly, lips pressed into a tight line. "Worry is a constant in life. Joy isn't." The words floated for a moment between them, sharp and cold like harmattan breeze. Mike didn't respond. He knew better than to argue with someone who'd already begun living part-time inside a dream. The room fell back into silence, save for the hiss of hot oil and the radio murmuring a preacher's voice from the neighbor's compound. Tension, when it lingers long enough, becomes invisible. It no longer roars, it hums. It seeps into the quiet moments, steals joy from laughter, and places unspoken boundaries in familiar spaces. By the third week of that month, Emily had begun to close up more than usual. She smiled at the children, held their hands on walks to the corner shop, even laughed occasionally at Aaron's gibberish. But Mike saw it. Her smile didn't settle in her eyes anymore. At night, when they sat side by side on the couch, their bodies barely touched. It was as though an invisible thread separated them, pulled tight and trembling. One night, while watching an old Yoruba movie, Emily suddenly said, "Sometimes I wonder if we're just roommates with shared responsibilities." Mike's hand froze on the remote. He didn't turn to face her, but he heard the quiver in her voice. "That's not fair," he said quietly. She shrugged. "Maybe, but it's how I feel." That sentence struck him deeper than he expected. Not because of what she said, but because of how casually it was delivered, like someone noting the weather, or the price of Gary. He turned off the television and walked out onto the veranda. The night was still, the sky clear, stars blinking above the rusted roofing sheets of the neighboring houses. He lit a stick of mint gum, something he chewed now to replace the cigarettes he'd quit years ago, and leaned against the wall. His thoughts swirled. Was this how love faded? Not in storms, but in quiet withdrawals? He heard the door creak behind him, but didn't turn. Emily stood in the doorway, arms folded. She didn't come closer. "Mike," she said, "if we don't want the same things anymore, what's left?" He bit the inside of his cheek and whispered, more to himself than to her, "We used to want everything together." The following weekend, Rachel came to visit. Rachel, with her bright laughter, her new wedding ring, and the unmistakable roundness of a first-trimester belly. She hugged Emily like a long-lost sister, her perfume trailing behind her like the tail of a comet. The two women sat under the mango tree in the backyard, their voices low, laughter sprinkled here and there like pepper in stew. Mike stayed inside, pretending to fix the handle on the back door, but his ears picked up pieces of the conversation like crumbs from a larger loaf. "I didn't even think I wanted another child," Rachel said. "But you should have seen how David looked at me when I told him. Like I'd given him a second sunrise." Emily giggled, but it was a sound Mike hadn't heard from her in months, a sound that felt like it no longer belonged to him. Later that evening, as they cleared the dishes together, Emily said, "Rachel's expecting again. Can you imagine?" Mike nodded. "I heard." Emily didn't hide her reaction. She said it brought her and David closer. Mike looked up sharply. "And you think that's our missing link? A baby?" Emily wiped her hands on a towel, then held the cloth tight like it anchored her to the floor. "I don't know, Mike. I want to feel full again." The phrase struck him, full again. It wasn't emptiness she was afraid of. It was the quiet middle, the stagnant water, the dull repetition of routine. Mike wanted to tell her that fullness came in seasons, not all at once. But instead, he turned away and said nothing. The silence after that was deafening. 3 days later, as Mike prepared to close his workshop near Sango, a familiar face appeared in the doorway. One of Emily's cousins, Benga, with eyes that looked too nervous for a casual visit. Benga scratched his head, avoided eye contact, and finally muttered, "I just thought you should know. Emily's been going to that private clinic by Total Garden, the one that does fertility consultations." Mike's hammer dropped from his hand and landed on the bench with a dull thud. He felt a hot wave rush through his chest, not of anger, but of betrayal stitched with confusion. He wanted to laugh, but nothing about it was funny. That night, he didn't confront her immediately. He watched her from across the dinner table, her eyes darting toward the children, her fork moving food she barely ate. When the children were asleep, Mike sat at the edge of the bed, his voice firm but low. "You've been going to a clinic." Emily didn't flinch. She only nodded. "I needed to speak to someone who would listen." His voice cracked slightly. "So I don't listen now." She met his eyes. "You hear me, Mike, but you don't listen anymore. You listen like a man trying to fix something, not understand it." That night, he slept on the couch. Not because she asked him to, but because the bed felt too crowded with silence. The morning after Mike slept on the couch, Emily made pap in silence and left the pot covered on the stove. She didn't wake the children or call out to him like she usually did. Her absence from the living room was louder than any argument. Mike woke up with a stiff neck and a headache that throbbed behind his eyes. The quietness of the house gnawed at his thoughts, scraping away the little piece he had managed to gather overnight. The smell of burnt oil lingered faintly, maybe from the neighbor's Acra stand, maybe from Emily's distracted cooking. He washed his face slowly, trying to gather courage like loose pieces of a broken calabash. Every sound in the house felt exaggerated. The ticking wall clock, the clink of plates, the soft thud of little feet scurrying in the hallway. The children were awake now, unaware of the growing wall between their parents. They laughed, argued over a toy, then disappeared into their room, their voices fading like the end of a song on radio static. When Mike entered the kitchen, he saw Emily by the sink, her back to him, her hand motionless under the running tap. She didn't turn. He stood there for a while, unsure if she knew he was behind her, unsure if he should speak or just pick a spoon and pretend the world was still intact. "You've been quiet," he said eventually, his voice rough from sleep and unshed emotion. Emily responded with a shrug, her shoulders rising and falling like a tired breath. "There's nothing else to say, Mike. You've made your decision. I've made mine." By the time afternoon crept in, the heat had become unbearable. Ibadan's sun showed no mercy, and the ceiling fan in the living room did little to fight it. Mike stepped out to the veranda, needing air, needing distance. But his mind kept replaying her words from that morning. "You've made your decision. I've made mine." He didn't know what her decision was exactly, but it echoed with finality. He looked across the street at Mama Iridi's kiosk where teenagers laughed over chilled drinks and puff-puff, and for a brief moment, he envied their simplicity, their unbothered joy. He hadn't smiled freely in weeks. Every time he tried, guilt or confusion sat on his chest like a stubborn weight. His phone buzzed with a message from his younger brother, a casual check-in that he ignored. He wasn't in the mood to explain things he himself didn't understand. Back inside, Emily was packing a small bag in the bedroom. She wasn't hiding it. She folded each item with precision, 2 wrappers, a blouse, flat slippers, a small toiletry bag. Mike stood at the doorway, his voice lower than a whisper. "Where are you going?" She didn't pause. "Rachel's place." Her tone was steady, free of emotion. "For how long?" he asked, though he feared the answer. "Until I can think clearly," she replied, closing the bag. Mike stepped into the room, heart beating too loudly in his ears. So, you're just leaving? She turned then, finally meeting his eyes. I need to be where I'm heard, Mike. Not managed. Not silenced. He didn't stop her. He couldn't. There were no locks strong enough to hold a heart that had already left. That evening, the house felt too large. The walls, once filled with Emily's scent, her laughter, her humming while doing laundry, now echoed like a shrine that had lost its deity. Mike sat on the couch, staring at the worn-out spot where she usually rested her feet. He watched as the children played with building blocks on the floor, their tiny hands creating towers that kept falling apart. He wondered if they too could sense something missing, something offbeat in the rhythm of their home. He wanted to call Emily, not to beg, but to understand what line he had crossed that could not be uncrossed. Yet pride, that old familiar beast, coiled itself around his voice and kept him silent. Instead, he played with Aaron, who giggled in his lap, oblivious to the storm behind the walls. Mike tried to lose himself in the moment, but the ache in his chest made it hard to breathe. He thought of the early days of their marriage when they used to sit on the floor during NEPA outages, sharing a single bowl of Gary and groundnuts, joking about how love would see them through. Those days felt far now, like a picture taken on another planet. He looked around at the home they had built together, the curtains Emily had chosen, the cracked vase she refused to throw away, the photo of their wedding still hanging crooked on the wall. Everything looked the same, yet everything had changed. The silence now was no longer filled with waiting. It felt like morning. 2 days passed before Mike saw Emily again. She returned not with a suitcase, but with purpose etched in every step. It was just past noon, the sky gray and threatening rain, and she stood by the doorway like someone unsure if they were still welcome in a house they helped build. Mike was in the middle of fixing Lena's broken shoe when he heard the knock. He opened the door and there she was, hair tied back, eyes tired but steady. She didn't come inside immediately. I came to talk, she said. Mike nodded and stepped aside. They sat across from each other at the dining table, like two negotiators at a ceasefire. She didn't waste time. If you won't give me the chance to have another baby, I'll have to go after it without you. The words were a sledgehammer wrapped in silk. Mike blinked. Emily, how did we get to this point? She leaned forward. Because I begged with my eyes. I pleaded with my silence. I asked for understanding, and I got strategy. You treated me like a crisis to be fixed, not a person with dreams. Mike's hands trembled slightly. We agreed. You know we did. She nodded. And I changed. Life changed me. I want more. I want to feel like a woman again, not just a mother doing rotations between school runs and cooking. I want to carry life again, not because I must, but because I can. There was no shouting, no theatrics. Just pain, honesty, and two people who had once promised forever now realizing they no longer shared the same horizon. That night, Emily returned to Rachel's, and Mike sat alone at the dining table, staring at the untouched food in front of him. The rain began to fall, slowly at first, then heavily, as though the sky itself had been holding back too long. Mike began to adjust to life without Emily's presence in the house, though the adjustment felt more like limping on a sprained ankle than healing from a wound. The children asked fewer questions than he expected. Lena mentioned once that she liked sleeping on Mummy's side of the bed now because it smelled like coconut cream. Sophie had asked if Mummy was on a trip or if she was sick. Mike, not knowing how to answer, simply said, "She's resting somewhere quiet." Aaron was too small to understand anything beyond faces and voices, but even he began to point at the front door sometimes, as if expecting her to walk in with his bottle. Mike kept himself busy. Repairs around the house, food shopping, school runs, but none of it filled the echo Emily had left behind. At night, when the children were asleep and the walls were still, he found himself folding laundry slower than usual, as if stretching each chore would slow down time. He touched her clothes sometimes, not to smell them, not to mourn, but to remind himself that she had been real, that all of it had been real. One night, while washing Aaron's bottle, he stared out the window and caught sight of the mango tree they had planted together 5 years ago. It now stood tall, branches stretching wide like arms waiting for something. That tree had survived floods, termites, and dry season. But now its leaves looked paler, as if it too was tired of waiting for light that never came. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, Mike took the children to Elliot River, a place Emily had always loved, especially during the months she carried Lena. The path there hadn't changed, same gravel crunch beneath shoes, same vendors with sugarcane and corn roasting near the edge. He held Aaron tightly in his arms while Sophie and Lena ran ahead, chasing a butterfly that refused to stay caught. Mike watched them, his heart swelling and sinking all at once. Parenthood, he thought, was a strange kind of beauty. Constant sacrifice, delayed rewards, and brief moments of wonder that kept you from collapsing entirely. As they reached the riverbank, Sophie spread her arms like wings and shouted, "Daddy! I'm flying!" Lena laughed behind her, holding a stick like a sword, defending invisible kingdoms only she could see. Mike sat on a low stone and let Aaron nap on his chest, the boys breathing warm against his neck. In that moment, surrounded by still water and trees that whispered secrets to the wind, Mike felt a quiet grief, not of loss but of incompleteness. He wasn't mourning Emily's absence. He was mourning the way things had changed, the way simple joys now came with a bitter aftertaste. He remembered their walks along this river, how Emily used to collect smooth stones and say they were prayers shaped by patience. Mike looked around now and wondered if some prayers were meant to remain unanswered. He stayed there until the sun began its descent, orange light spilling across the sky like palm oil on water. Later that evening, Rachel called him. It was unexpected. They had only exchanged polite greetings in the past. Her voice was calm, but there was something careful about her tone, like someone tiptoeing through broken glass. "She's not herself," she said. "She smiles during the day but cries at night. Last night, I heard her talking to someone in her sleep. She said your name." Mike didn't know what to say. Rachel continued. "She talks about starting over, rebuilding something new. But she doesn't sound hopeful. It's like she's forcing herself to believe a version of life that even she doubts." Mike sat in silence, the phone pressed against his ear like it weighed 100 stones. "She said you never chose her dreams," Rachel added. That sentence burned. It wasn't the truth that hurt. It was the part of it he couldn't deny. After the call ended, Mike sat alone for a long time. He thought about how easily love could become a battleground when both people stopped being vulnerable. Pride had sat between them for months, like an uninvited guest that neither dared to chase away. He wanted to drive to Rachel's house right that moment, to hold Emily's hands, to tell her that maybe dreams could bend instead of break. But something held him back, not fear but uncertainty. What if she had already closed the door? What if he was knocking on a house that no longer had space for his kind of love? 3 days later, Emily showed up at the gate unannounced. She wasn't carrying a bag. She didn't knock for long. Mike had just come in from the market, a bag of pepper and onions still in his hand. He froze when he saw her. She looked different, lighter, not in weight, but in energy. As if she had let go of something that had been weighing her spirit down. "I just came to see the children," she said, not waiting for permission before stepping in. They sat at the dining table later, after the children had gone to bed, and for the first time in weeks, they spoke, not about the past, not about arguments or decisions, but about moments. Mike told her about Sophie's drawing of a house with 5 windows and only 1 door. Emily laughed softly and said, "That's just like her." Mike offered her water, and she accepted, their fingers brushing as he passed the cup. After a long pause, she looked at him and said, "I've been asking myself if what I want is a baby, or the feeling of beginning again. Maybe I confused the two." Mike's eyes didn't leave hers. "I've been wondering if what I was trying to protect was our peace, or my control." The silence between them wasn't heavy this time. It was soft, reflective, almost sacred. Emily stood to leave, but this time she hesitated at the door. "I'm not saying I'm coming back, but I want to believe we still see each other." Mike nodded, his throat thick. "I see you, Emily." I never stopped. The days that followed Emily's unannounced visit passed like the quiet after rainfall, still uncertain, but somehow cleansing. Mike didn't call her, and she didn't return. Yet her presence lingered, not as a shadow but as a question waiting patiently for an answer. He found himself doing little things with more intention now, not out of hope or fear, but awareness. When Lena asked him to help with her school project, he didn't just supervise. He joined her, cutting cardboard and gluing paper, as if each piece might bring structure to something inside him too. Aaron's giggles became a melody that followed him, even after the boy had fallen asleep. Sophie told him she dreamed of Mummy walking through the door with a baby wrapped in gold cloth, and for a second, Mike almost believed it might mean something more. But he quickly reminded himself not to assign meaning where none had been spoken. Some things, he'd come to learn, are better felt than forced. His mother called one afternoon, asking him if he had heard any good news yet. He only laughed and said, "Not everything that starts shaking will fall down, Mama." She sighed on the phone and said a prayer he couldn't fully hear because of poor reception. But it warmed him anyway. He thought about how marriages rarely break from explosions. Most die from the quiet erosion of moments not handled with care. And now that he could see how much had been left unsaid between them, he wondered if a home could ever truly be rebuilt after the pillars had cracked, even if the roof still stood. One evening, as the sunset cast long shadows across the backyard, Mike sat beneath the mango tree with Aaron on his lap. The air was calm, the leaves barely moving, and the sky above held that deep orange abaddon glow that made everything look like it was dipped in bronze. He looked at his son's small hands, soft and unaware, clutching a toy spoon like it was treasure. There was a gentleness in that moment that he hadn't felt in weeks. No loud thoughts, no arguments in his mind, just a quiet appreciation for what remained. He thought about the version of Emily he fell in love with, the one who danced barefoot in their old one-room apartment, holding a basin of wet laundry and singing along to Ace's voice on the radio. He thought about the Emily who whispered scripture over their first child's crib, afraid but brave. That version of her still lived somewhere, perhaps buried under layers of motherhood, exhaustion, unmet desires, and quiet disappointments. And he wasn't innocent either. He had slowly become more focused on surviving than seeing. He had looked at her pain like a riddle to solve rather than an experience to hold. Love, he now understood, wasn't always about providing answers. Sometimes it was simply standing beside someone while they questioned everything. Aaron dozed off, and Mike carried him back inside. The house smelled like dust and onions. He wiped the boy's face gently and whispered, "You deserve parents who choose each other, not just you." The words hung in the air like breath on glass, fleeting, fragile, but real. Emily returned on a Friday afternoon, wearing a blue dress Mike hadn't seen in years. She looked almost like herself again, face bare, hair tied loosely, eyes softer. She carried nothing in her hands, but wore an expression that hinted at something heavier than luggage. The children screamed her name and ran toward her, arms wide, as if joy had been bottled up and someone had just uncorked it. She hugged them one by one, pressing their foreheads to hers like she was relearning their features. Mike stood at the door, watching, unsure whether to walk forward or stay where he was. She met his eyes briefly, and in that glance was everything: regret, love, confusion, and something that looked dangerously close to peace. That evening, they sat again at the dining table. There was no speech prepared, no dramatic apology or plea. Just warm rice and vegetable sauce, and the sounds of spoons clinking gently against ceramic. After dinner, they sat outside, the children asleep, the world quieter than it had been in months. "I don't want a divorce," Emily said, finally breaking the silence. "But I also don't want to feel like I'm the only one still dreaming." Mike looked down, his fingers tracing lines on the wooden armrest of the chair. "I never stopped dreaming. I just stopped believing the dream would survive reality." She nodded slowly. "Maybe we need a new dream. One we both shape. One that isn't just about babies or silence." Mike reached for her hand, and this time she didn't pull away. They sat there, side by side, beneath a sky full of blinking stars, saying nothing more. Because sometimes the most honest conversations happen in the spaces words leave behind. In the weeks that followed, there was no sudden transformation. No magic. No new baby. But something had shifted, quietly, like the earth beneath the surface realigning itself. They started walking together again, sometimes with the children, sometimes without. On those walks, they didn't talk much, but they looked at the same things: the cracks in the sidewalk, the lizards darting across the walls, the old woman who sold roasted yam under the baobab tree. They made small decisions together: what to cook, what to watch, when to visit Emily's aunt. Trust wasn't fully restored, but the tools to rebuild it were slowly appearing between them. Mike learned to ask more than he answered, and Emily learned to stay even when the words didn't come easily. One day, while folding laundry together, she picked up a baby bib and smiled. "This one is Aaron's," she said. "I used to think if I had another baby, I'd feel young again. But I think what I really wanted was to feel seen." Mike took the bib from her and placed it gently in the drawer. "I see you now," he said. "And I'm still here." They laughed about something Sophie said that morning and moved on to other chores. Life didn't return to what it had been. It became something else. Something slower. More intentional. A house with fewer assumptions and more questions. And though neither of them said it aloud, they both knew. They had chosen to begin again, not with fireworks or promises, but with presence. And sometimes that was enough. Sometimes love doesn't disappear. It just forgets how to speak. In relationships, silence can be louder than shouting, and dreams left unspoken can quietly become demands. If you're with someone you care about, Don't wait until the silence becomes a wall. Speak. Listen. Bend where needed. And above all, keep choosing each other, not just the idea of each other. Growth isn't always about adding more. Sometimes, it's about deepening what's already there. May your home be full of peace that speaks louder than problems. May understanding fill your rooms like sunlight through a window. May your love not only survive the storms, but learn to dance in the rain. May you and yours never lack patience, joy, or the courage to begin again. May God restore what felt broken, strengthen what felt weak, and bless your steps with wisdom that doesn't fade. If your heart agrees, say a loud and joyful amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.